The fatty is too old at 35, they mocked. The mountain man's proposal left everyone speechless. Folks in Pine Hollow like to talk, and when a woman named Clara stepped off the stagecoach with soft eyes, calloused hands, and a body the town called too much and too late, they laughed. 35, no husband, no children, a fatty, they said, past her prime. But they didn't know the man who'd been watching from the timberline, the one they called a ghost, a bear, a beast. Why would a feared recluse descend from the mountains for a woman like her? Why did he kneel in front of the entire town, eyes burning with tears and fury? And what secret did they share that would silence every cruel mouth in Pine Hollow? In a world where judgment is loud and kindness is quiet, sometimes the loudest answer is love that refuses to explain itself. When a recluse steps forward and a woman once mocked holds her head high, the world has to ask itself, who truly sees and who only judges? What makes a man choose love when the world expects silence? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. Let me know which state you are watching from and subscribe to help us keep bringing these frontier tales to life. Clara Bell stepped off the stagecoach with a hiss of steam and the crunch of gravel beneath worn leather soles. The sun hung low over Pine Hollow, casting long shadows from crooked storefronts and leaning hitching posts. She carried a single canvas sack, faded and patched, slung over one shoulder. Tucked beneath her arm was a worn journal, tied with blue ribbon. Her boots were scuffed, her cheeks windburned, and her body, full and wide, moved with the quiet dignity of someone who had long ago learned to expect little and ask for less. The driver didn't offer to help her down. No one did. Folks on the boardwalk glanced her way, then away just as fast. Murmurs chased her steps like flies. There she is, the one they warned us about. Looks like she ate her own wagon team. Too old to be looking for a husband. What's she thinking? 35 if she's a day. Clara didn't answer. She'd heard worse, much worse. Her own sister Luella had spat more poison in one sentence than this town could muster in a day. "You're a burden now, Clara," Luella had said, slapping the deed to their mother's land onto the kitchen table. "No husband, no child, just sitting in the house like a ghost." The paper was already signed. Clara's birthright sold off for a fast dollar and a few lines of ink. The house she helped build, the garden her mother once knelt in, gone. She had left at dawn the next day, with nothing but her journal, a locket of hair, and the blessing of a preacher too old to rise from his chair. Now Pine Hollow stood before her, dusty, tight-lipped, and cruel in that quiet, smirking way of frontier towns that believe virtue came in narrow shapes. Clara walked the length of Main Street with her chin lifted. She stopped at the livery first, offering to help mend saddles, but the stable hand just laughed and shook his head. "Ain't no horse want your kind near it," he said. At the seamstress's shop, she was told they didn't need extra fabric. At the hotel kitchen, the cook took one look and said, "We don't feed strays." The preacher's house was closed. She knocked twice. No answer. By noon, she found herself leaning against the side of the saloon, her stomach hollow and her throat dry. A loud clatter of chairs and boots startled her. 3 men stumbled from the swinging doors, drunk and grinning. One held a bowl of brown stew. Another pointed. "Well now, if it ain't a bear dressed in a bonnet," one slurred. The man with the stew flung its contents across her skirt. "Share the meal, darlin'." Hot broth and cold laughter ran down her legs. Clara froze, her jaw clenched tight, her fists trembling at her sides. But she said nothing. She turned and walked, slow and stiff, to the back of the stable. There, behind the stacked hay and rusted tools, she sank down to her knees and wept silently into her hands. Above the town in the rustling shadows of the pine ridge, a figure watched from behind a narrow tree. His beard was thick, his coat rough-spun, his hands scarred from winters long past. Eyes like flint narrowed beneath the brim of a battered hat. The townsfolk called him mad. They said he once bit a man's ear clean off. They said he hadn't spoken in a decade. Children dared each other to run up the ridge and touch his fence, but no one ever made it close. They called him the ghost of the mountain. And now, as he watched the woman crumple behind the stable, alone, soaked in stew and shame, his jaw set tight, his knuckles whitened against the pine bark. The mocking laughter still echoed in the wind, but he didn't move. Not yet, but he'd seen enough. Colt McCrae had not set foot on the dust-packed streets of Pine Hollow since the day 2 pine boxes were lowered into the frozen soil behind the chapel. 10 winters had come and gone since then, each one carving more lines into his face, roughening his voice into silence, and hardening the hands that once cradled a newborn girl. In town, his name was spoken with caution, behind doors barely cracked. They said he'd lost his mind, said the wild had swallowed him whole, but they didn't know the truth. It wasn't madness that kept him away. It was grief, a grief too big for cabins and sermons, too deep for language. So he built walls from wood and snow and silence, high up where the timberline kissed the sky, and he let the world forget him. That morning, as he crouched among the boulders, eyes trained on the town below, Colt spotted her. She wasn't like the others, not like the chattering women with curled hair and hard eyes. She didn't preen or plead. She moved slow, steady, like someone used to carrying invisible weight. Her dress clung damp from what they'd thrown at her, but she didn't flinch. Not even when the laughter rose behind her like a pack of coyotes. He watched her wipe her face, not frantic, but firm. Her back was bent, but not broken. Her walk from the saloon to the stables had a limp of pride, not pain. That small defiance stirred something inside Colt, something he thought he'd buried with Lily and Ruthie beneath the birch tree. Night fell fast on Pine Hollow. The stars wheeled in silence overhead as the wind swept down the ridge in sighs. Colt moved through the forest like a whisper, his rifle slung across his back, his breath slow and sure. Below, Clara lay curled beneath a horse blanket behind the stables, her sack as a pillow, her journal clutched tight to her chest. The fire in town had long since died, but another kind of heat simmered, eyes that had seen too much watching from the dark. The wolves came just past midnight, 3 of them, lean and desperate, drawn by the smell of hay, feed, and human fear. Their low growls pierced the quiet. Clara stirred in her sleep, her breath catching. One wolf crept closer, its eyes reflecting starlight. It snarled. Then from the trees came a sharp whistle. Not loud, not panicked, just precise. A shape moved like stone breaking loose. Colt stepped between the stable and the wolves. He raised no rifle, spoke no words. Just stood tall, shoulders squared, eyes burning. The lead wolf paused, snarled again. Colt raised a hand, fingers spread. His voice, when it came, was low thunder. Go! The pack hesitated, then backed away. The trees swallowed them again. Clara sat up, heart pounding, lips parted. She saw only a silhouette, broad shoulders, long coat, and the glint of a silver belt buckle. He didn't turn toward her, didn't wait for thanks, just vanished like fog into the woods. The next morning the sky was pale with frost and promise. Clara woke to find a stack of fresh chopped firewood leaning against the stable wall. A blanket, thick and clean, lay folded beside her journal. Her name was scratched into the leather binding. Someone had wiped the dirt off. For the first time in weeks, her fingers didn't tremble as she traced it. She looked up at the ridge where the trees began. She couldn't see him, but she knew someone was watching, and whoever he was, he had no interest in mocking her, only in keeping her warm. Word travels fast in towns like Pine Hollow, especially when mystery lingers in the cold air like wood smoke. By the morning after the wolf scare, whispers floated from the saloon to the mercantile like embers leaping from one rooftop to the next. Someone had seen a figure, tall, broad, cloaked in shadow, near the back of the stables where Clara Bell had spent the night. A man had driven off wolves without a shot fired, left wooden blankets behind. A ghost, some said. Others weren't so poetic. Must have been him. Colt McCrae. Who else had walked that ridge at night? I thought he was dead. Dead men don't stack kindlin'. The rumors clung to Clara like frost. She heard them as she walked with quiet steps toward the preacher's house, where Miss Adeline had taken pity and offered her laundry and mending work. A basket of linens waited on the back porch. Clara folded sleeves with care, her fingers red and raw from the soap. Every wrinkle she smoothed was another breath drawn without shame. Inside, Miss Adeline brought her warm tea and watched through the curtain as townsfolk passed. They can say what they will, she said, but the Lord don't judge by waistlines or birthdays. Clara gave a soft nod. It was the closest anyone had come to kindness since she'd arrived. Still, behind her back, the old words returned. Too old. No husband. Unfit. Women turned their eyes away. Men pretended she didn't exist, unless they were sneering. The town had its way of deciding who mattered, and Clara didn't. But she had her journal. At night in the church's empty loft, she sat cross-legged on the wooden floor and wrote by candlelight. Lines flowed from her like river water, memories, prayers, dreams stitched in verse. She wrote of gardens never planted, lullabies never sung, and sometimes she wrote about the mountain, about the silent watcher who moved like winter wind and left traces of care behind. There were signs now, more than once. A pouch of dried mint left neatly on her folded blanket. Wild berries wrapped in a birch leaf. A simple carved spoon, smooth with oil and shaped by a steady hand. He never appeared, not fully, but the offerings were real. His silence spoke a language she was starting to understand. Miss Adeline noticed the change in her posture, the steadier smile, the way Clara began humming as she worked. She didn't press, but she did say one evening, as they shelled beans by lamplight, a man who carves and leaves instead of speaking, sometimes that's the kind who's already spoken where it matters most. The town noticed too, not the gifts, but Clara's stillness, her lack of fear, and how even as they mocked, she never fired back. That kind of grace unsettled them. Rumors grew. She's touched by the ghost. He's cursed, remember? Lost his wife, buried the baby, never let no one see the graves. Now he's after her. One morning, Clara rose early to check her basket. Her journal, which she'd left open to dry from a spill, lay on the porch rail. Sitting atop its pages was a tiny bird, carved from pine, wings tucked close, beak tilted skyward. It was sanded smooth and painted with crushed berries. It didn't say, I see you, or you matter, but somehow it said both. The bell above the general store door gave a sharp clang as Clara stepped inside, arms tucked close to her body, eyes cast downward. The room smelled of dust and molasses. Two men leaned near the counter, laughing too loud at something in a catalog. Behind them, the shopkeeper's son, a wiry boy with a cruel streak and too much time, watched her. Clara gathered what little she needed, a bar of soap, 2 buttons, a tin of dried peas. She stepped up to the counter, placing her coins down one by one with quiet precision. But the boy said nothing. Instead, he reached beneath the counter and pulled out a parcel. Ma says this came in special for you, he smirked. Clara hesitated, then slowly untied the string. Inside lay a dress, bright red satin, gaudy, cut to scandal. Pinned to it was a note scrawled in crooked ink. Maybe he'll want you now. Laughter cracked the silence. One man slapped his knee, the other whistled low. That'd fit a whole wagon team, someone chuckled behind her. Clara stood frozen, blood roaring in her ears, the dress clutched in one shaking hand. Then she dropped it, turned, and walked out the door without a word. Her steps quickened, then broke into a run. She didn't know where she was going, only that it had to be away. Past the saloon, past the livery, past the preacher's gate. Tears streamed down her cheeks, hot and silent, as she crossed the town's edge and disappeared into the trees. The woods welcomed her with cold silence. Branches clawed at her skirt. Roots snagged her boots. The sky dimmed to bruised purple as night fell faster than she expected. Soon she couldn't tell which way she'd come. Her breath came in sobs. Somewhere in the distance, wolves began to howl again. One cry turned into two, then three, then many. Panic gripped her chest like iron. That was when she heard the branch crack. She turned, heart in her throat. Colt McCrae stepped from between two trees like he'd grown from the bark itself. His coat was dusted in pine needles, his hat pulled low. He said nothing, just raised one hand, slow and calm, and beckoned. Clara hesitated for a breath. Then she followed. They walked in silence for what felt like miles. The forest thickened, then thinned. At last they crested a rise and stepped into a clearing. There, tucked between two great stones, stood a cabin. Rough-hewn logs, smoke curling from the chimney. A wooden fence leaned in half-circle. Light glowed soft from inside. Colt opened the door. She stepped in. It was simple but alive. Every object had a purpose. Handmade chairs, shelves lined with dried herbs and tin tools. A thick animal pelt spread over a bed that looked untouched. The air smelled of cedar, smoke, and something faintly sweet. Berries or tea. A kettle hung over the hearth. Without a word, Colt poured her a tin cup and handed it to her. Clara sat by the fire. Her hands stopped shaking. The warmth seeped into her bones like mercy. She stared into the flames, then looked up at him. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice low. He didn't answer right away. Then he crouched beside the fire, eyes shadowed and steady. "You remind me of someone who didn't deserve what she got." That was all. He gave her the bed that night, drawing the heavy pelt over her shoulders before stepping outside with a rifle slung across his back. She watched him through the window, just a shape by the fence line, standing guard beneath the stars. And for the first time in years, Clara slept through the night. The days that followed passed like pages in a quiet book, each one turning with little sound, but deep meaning. The mountain cabin became a rhythm, silent, steady, and full of a strange comfort Clara hadn't known in years. She and Colt did not speak much. Their words were few, yet the silence between them was not empty. It was healing. Colt rose before the sun. He chopped wood with purposeful swings, every movement shaped by years of discipline. Clara woke to the scent of smoke and pine, her hands eager to find something to do. She swept the floor, washed tin cups in the basin, stacked herbs, wiped shelves, and stirred whatever stew she could manage from the larder. It was simple work, but it gave her hands direction, her mind peace. Purpose was something she hadn't felt in a long while. One morning, as she leaned over the kettle to lift it from the fire, the steam caught her hand. She gasped and dropped the handle. The pain was sharp, immediate. Before she could even wrap it in her shawl, Colt was there. He didn't speak. He just crouched, took her hand in his, and gently pressed a cool salve she hadn't noticed before onto the burn. Then he wrapped her palm in a strip of soft cloth he pulled from a carved wooden box. His touch was careful, practiced. She watched his face, not stern, not tender, but focused, kind. That evening, Clara sat by the fire, fingers curled around her journal. She opened it not to write, but to read aloud. Her voice was unsure at first. She shared a poem about a garden gate her mother used to lean on when she was tired. and how silence sometimes sounds like goodbye. Colt didn't interrupt. He didn't praise or critique, but when she glanced up, he gave a slow nod. Later, when she read a small story about a tree that refused to fall even when struck by lightning, he let out a low hum of agreement. Not approval, understanding. Each night she read more. Fragments, prayers, dreams she had once buried. And each night, Colt listened with the quiet reverence of a man who had once known beauty and now recognized it again. On the fourth evening, a soft rustle broke the stillness outside. Clara rose to check the door. What she saw froze her in place. A black bear, massive and slow-moving, padding toward the fence just 10 feet away. Her breath caught, her body stiffened. She backed into the room, words caught in her throat. But Colt was already there. He didn't reach for a weapon. He stepped out the door, boots silent against the packed earth. He moved between her and the beast, standing tall, arms at his sides. The bear paused. Its nostrils flared. The moment held. Two creatures shaped by wilderness, one of fur, the other of grief. Colt didn't shout. He simply stared. After a long pause, the bear huffed and turned, lumbering back toward the trees. Clara stared at Colt as he stepped back inside. His face was unchanged, but something in her had shifted. He wasn't a brute. He wasn't a ghost. He was a man, a protector. She waited until he sat beside the fire again, then quietly asked, "What's your name?" He looked at her. Really looked. For the first time, something opened behind his eyes. "Colt," he said. Just that, and nothing more. But that single word filled the room like sunlight after snow. Snow had begun falling before dawn, soft as breath against the cabin roof. Clara watched it from the window, steam curling from her tea, a quilt drawn up over her lap. The world outside was hushed in white, the trees blanketed, the sky colorless. The fire crackled low behind her, and Colt was outside splitting wood, each thud echoing steady and sure into the quiet morning. The hush was almost holy. Her eyes wandered the room, now familiar, the shelf of handmade tools, the orderly bundles of herbs, the polished stone bowl that caught water from the roof leak. But something in the corner drew her gaze again. Tucked beneath a folded hide, nearly hidden by the shadows, was a small wooden cradle. Its curves were simple, its rockers worn smooth. It was far too small for use now, yet there it stood, untouched, waiting. When Colt returned, boots brushing snow from the threshold, she waited until he'd settled near the fire. Her voice was quiet, respectful. "Whose was it?" He didn't answer right away. He didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the flames, jaw set, shoulders tight beneath the weight of memory. Clara didn't push. She returned to sipping her tea, letting the silence stretch until it became permission. "My wife," he said at last, his voice rough from disuse. "Lily." Clara nodded, not interrupting. "She died in this cabin," he continued, the words slow, each one seeming to cost him breath. "Birthing our daughter. Ruthie." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The firelight flickered across his face, carving deep shadows beneath his eyes. She didn't cry when she came out, not once, just opened her eyes, looked at me like she knew something I didn't. I wrapped her up, kept her warm as I could. But the cold that year, it got in everywhere. He swallowed hard. She made it 3 months, never gained weight. One morning I went to change her, and he stopped. The rest didn't need saying. I buried them under the birch out back, built a ring of stone, been here since. He leaned back slowly, gaze drifting to the cradle. "People don't get second chances," he said. Not bitter, not angry, just matter of fact, as if he were reciting something long settled in his bones. Clara didn't offer platitudes. She didn't reach for him. She simply rose, walked to her satchel, and pulled from it a small bundle of dried lavender she'd gathered from near the creek. Without a word, she set it gently on the hearth. The scent filled the room, soft, floral, calming. That evening, while Colt stepped outside to tend the fence line, Clara lit a single beeswax candle. She walked to the cradle, lifted the hide with care, and placed the candle inside. It glowed faintly, flickering against the smooth wood, casting shadows that danced like memories. When Colt came back in, he didn't speak. His eyes lingered on the cradle, then flicked to Clara. He gave the smallest nod, then turned away, wiping his cheek with the back of his hand, as if brushing off snow. But Clara saw and said nothing. Some grief didn't need words, only witness. The wind shifted in Pine Hollow the day Silas Greeley arrived. He came dressed in a long black coat stitched with silver thread, a hat too clean for trail dust, and boots that never scuffed no matter how hard they struck the ground. His grin was wide and white, but it didn't reach his eyes. Those were cold, like pond ice in February, and just as deadly. He rode into town with a ledger thicker than a Bible and a stack of deeds tucked beneath his arm. Folks on the boardwalk paused as he passed, tipping hats, whispering. They knew what he was. He called himself a businessman. Everyone else knew he was a predator with ink for teeth. He had a taste for land, especially when the owners were too poor, too tired, or too dead to stop him. And now he had his sights set higher, up near the timberline, where the forest met sky. "Old McCrae land," he muttered, tracing a map with a gloved finger. "Used to belong to some Bell woman. Should have been swallowed up years ago." Inside the saloon, Silas laid out his plans over bourbon and bluster. He waved the deeds like cards in a gambler's hand. "We're bringing progress," he said to the gathered men. "Rail line might just snake through that ridge if we clear it right. Time this town joined the century." But when he mentioned the name on the land, Clara Bell, a hush fell over the table. "She's up there," someone whispered, "with McCrae." Silas's eyes narrowed. "That ghost?" The men exchanged nervous glances. No one wanted to speak first. Finally, the bartender cleared his throat. "He's been seen near the stables, protected her once. Folk think he's watching her now." That's when the grin returned, but sharper this time. "So she thinks she can hide behind a madman in the mountains?" he said, swirling his drink. "No woman defies me. No land gets left unclaimed." He wasted no time. By mid-morning, Silas stood in the town clerk's office filing papers. They were forged, of course, but made to look real. Legal notices declaring Clara mentally unfit, a danger to herself. He claimed she'd wandered off, delusional, and was in need of guardianship. The signatures were lies the witnesses bought. But that never stopped a man like Silas. "She's alone, weak, out of place," he said, folding the paper with care. "She needs a protector. She'll be safer in town, under my care." When the clerk hesitated, Silas leaned in close and whispered, "Or would you rather explain to the judge why you denied a woman the safety of a proper home?" Later that afternoon, Miss Adeline heard the news. She stood on the preacher's porch, face pale, hands trembling. The land Clara had fled to, the very ridge she now called sanctuary, was suddenly marked on a map not with her name, but Silas's claim. Without delay, she called for Thomas, the swiftest rider in town. She handed him a sealed envelope, pressed into his palm with firm urgency. "Take this to the ridge. Find Colt McCrae. Give it to Clara Bell. Tell them trouble's coming, fast and dressed in law." As the rider galloped into the wild, snow swirling behind him like smoke, the town fell into a quiet unease. Something was shifting. A storm was brewing, not in the sky, but in the hearts of men who believe power meant possession. And in that quiet cabin high in the pines, a woman with ink-stained fingers and a man carved from grief would soon be forced to face it. The knock came just after sunrise, sharp and urgent, against the cabin door. Colt opened it with his rifle slung across his back, always cautious. The rider stood there, breathless, his coat lined with frost and sweat. He didn't step inside, just handed over a sealed envelope with Miss Adeline's familiar script in a single sentence. "They're coming." Clara took the letter with trembling fingers and read it slowly, each word sinking like cold iron into her chest. Silas Greeley had filed for custody, claimed she was unstable, unfit, that she'd run off into the wilderness in a fit of madness and must be brought back, either as wife or ward. The documents were forged, but the law had teeth when wielded by men like Silas. His reach, it seemed, had climbed even the ridges. She folded the letter with care, then stood and turned toward her things, her journal, her shawl, the few clothes she had left. Her hands were steady, but her eyes swam. "I won't bring ruin to this place," she whispered. "You've lived with ghosts long enough. You don't need my trouble, too." Colt didn't say anything at first. He stood still, arms crossed, his brow drawn tight. Then slowly he reached out and laid a hand over hers as she grasped her satchel. His hand was warm, solid, unmoving. "You stay," he said. His voice was low, but it filled the room like thunder wrapped in kindness. "If they want you, they'll have to come through me." Clara's breath caught. Her legs wobbled. She stared at him, unsure if she had heard right. He didn't flinch, didn't repeat himself, and so she nodded. The next morning, snow still falling in lazy spirals, Clara stood before the north wall of the cabin. The old paint there, soft swirls of blues and greens, had faded into near invisibility. She traced them with her fingers, following curves and petals long hidden by time. Lily's murals, once vibrant, now ghost-like, just like the woman who painted them. She picked up a brush. Colt watched from the porch as her strokes began. Slow, careful, like memory rediscovered. She mixed crushed berries and pine soot for color. She restored each vine, each bloom, each tender leaf. The cabin, once still and silent, hummed again. He found himself sitting on the step longer than he intended, watching her. She didn't look afraid, not anymore. She looked resolute. And something in him softened further. He went to his workshop, where his carving tools had gathered dust. His hands moved without thinking, not birds this time, not gifts of warning or watchfulness. No, this was different. A tiny horse, a wagon with wheels that turned, the sort of toy a child might clutch and name. He sanded the edges smooth, polished the wood until it glowed golden. He wasn't sure why he carved it, but his hands knew before his heart did. Inside, Clara painted a small blue butterfly onto the corner of the mural, a new thing, all her own. Outside, Colt set the finished toy gently on the windowsill, then returned to his bench, chisel in hand, snow gathering in his beard. They didn't speak much that day, but every silence between them said, "We're staying." The knock on the cabin door came just after mid-morning. Softer this time, more deliberate than the hurried pound of a warning. Colt was already halfway to the porch when Clara peeked through the window. A figure in a thick blue cloak stood brushing snow from her shoulders, breath blooming in clouds before her lips. Miss Adeline. She brought with her a tin of strong tea wrapped in flannel, a basket of late winter root vegetables, and a satchel stuffed with more than kindness. Clara opened the door and was pulled into a firm, wordless hug that smelled of soap and lavender. Colt stepped aside, nodding once. Inside, Miss Adeline sat at the table, her gloved hands unrolling papers with crisp precision. "Clara," she said, smoothing out a legal document. Your mother never truly signed away the Bell land. There's a clause in the original deed. The title defaults to you unless contested under proper process, which Silas never followed. Clara's breath caught. You mean it's still mine? Only if you stand and say so, Miss Adeline replied. Silas is bluffing with half-truths and a crooked clerk. But if you show your face in town, testify before the magistrate, you could keep it. All of it. Colt leaned against the wall, arms crossed. He said nothing, but his eyes didn't leave Clara's face. The townsfolk, Clara began. They're starting to talk, Adeline interrupted gently. Starting to question the way Silas moves through this place like it belongs to him. You showing up with the truth might be the crack we need. Clara traced the edge of the parchment with one finger. For years, her life had been ruled by silence, by the weight of shame that never belonged to her. Running had been the only choice, but now here was a window cracked open, however narrow, a chance to stop running, a chance to claim something. Still, her voice trembled. If I go back, they'll look at me like they did before, like I'm a joke, a burden, too old, too much. Colt's voice cut in low, rough as tree bark. They'll judge. That's what they do. He pushed off from the wall, walking toward her. But I've seen you stand straighter after their worst. You were never made to be small. She looked up at him. If I go, and they don't believe me, they will, Miss Adeline said softly, because I'll be standing beside you, and so will others. They're starting to remember what right looks like. That night, after the fire died down and the cabin glowed in its own hush, Colt sat whittling in the corner. Clara stared into the hearth. The deed folded beside her journal. After a long silence, he set his carving down and looked at her. You sure? He asked. She turned to him, face steady now, voice like iron wrapped in velvet. You gave me shelter, she said. Now I fight for mine. He didn't smile, but he nodded. Just once. In the shadows, the tiny horse and wagon he'd carved earlier sat on the windowsill, bathed in the light of a rising moon. The clouds rolled in thick and gray as Clara and Colt began their descent. The mountain behind them groaned beneath a sky heavy with snow. Each gust of wind bit colder than the last, stinging their cheeks and tugging at Clara's cloak like it wanted to pull her backward. But she pressed forward, boots crunching against the ice-packed trail, face set with a determination carved over weeks of healing and years of hiding. Colt said little as they walked, but his presence was solid beside her, steady as a pine tree weathering a storm. He carried a wrapped bundle slung across his back, and though the snowfall quickened and the wind howled harder, he didn't quicken his pace. He just walked beside her, matching her stride, silent but unwavering. By the time they reached the outskirts of Pine Hollow, the blizzard had become a wall of white. Snow whipped sideways and the rooftops of the town blurred in the distance like ghosts. As they entered the first row of buildings, a hush fell over the boardwalks. People stopped to stare. Children huddled in doorways whispered and pointed. A boy laughed aloud. Look at the size of her! A group of women standing beneath fur-lined parasols turned their heads and smirked. One leaned toward another and said, not quietly, I suppose the beast has a type after all. Clara kept walking. Each step forward felt heavier than the last, but she did not look down. Her hands gripped her shawl tight around her shoulders. She didn't speak. She didn't slow. The ridicule slid off her like rain over rock, and behind her, Colt's boots struck the ground like a warning. They made their way to the church, the bell tower silent in the snow. The preacher, a thin man with deep lines and kind eyes, opened the door before they could knock. His face lit up with recognition and relief. Come in, child, he said, ushering them inside. This storm's no place for the righteous to wait. The warmth inside hit Clara like a balm. Fire crackled in the hearth. The wooden pews were empty. the sanctuary quiet. She stepped in slowly, brushing snow from her sleeves. Colt entered behind her and stood just inside the door, shaking off the cold. The preacher brought them tea, blankets, and silence, the respectful kind. He asked no questions, just nodded toward the back room, where they could sleep safely for the night. Before closing the door, he placed a firm hand on Colt's shoulder. "I remember you," he said softly. "You came to bury your girls. Now you've come to raise something else." Outside, Silas Greeley stood beneath the overhang of the hotel, watching the church through narrowed eyes. The blizzard danced around him, but he was still as stone. He'd seen Clara enter, seen the giant beside her. His lip curled in distaste. "She came back," he muttered, then turned toward the sheriff's office. "Then we used the past. She gave it to us once. We'll make sure it breaks her this time." He had the papers ready. An old accusation, never proven, whispered by a cousin desperate to rid the family of its shame. The town wouldn't care if it was true. All they needed was doubt, and Silas was good at planting doubt like weeds. As the snow deepened and the town darkened beneath its weight, Colt sat in the church's side room with a whetstone and a hunting knife. He moved the blade slowly across the stone, over and over, until it gleamed. He wasn't preparing for war. He was preparing for truth. And this time, he wasn't alone. The town hall was colder than the air outside, not from the temperature, but from the tension thick as smoke. The benches were filled, storekeepers, ranch hands, gossips, the curious, the cruel, all pressed together in uneasy silence, waiting for the show. At the front stood the magistrate, an aging man with sun-leathered skin and a deep crease between his eyes. He looked tired, like he'd presided over too many petty disputes and not enough justice. At the center, Clara Bell stood in a plain dress, hands folded at her waist. Beside her, Colt McCrae sat still as a boulder, his broad frame shadowing her without a word spoken. His eyes never left Silas Greeley. Silas paced with performative calm, holding aloft a set of crinkled letters as though they were scripture. His voice was smooth, too smooth, slick with false concern. "We are here not to condemn," he began, "but to protect. This poor woman, Clara Bell, has been adrift since her mother passed. We have testimony from her own kin that she was unstable, that she fled home in a state of confusion, that she placed herself in danger by wandering into the wild under delusion." He produced a stack of papers, neatly folded, perfectly signed, and passed them to the magistrate. "Here we have her medical evaluation from back east, a record of episodes, a doctor's note suggesting guardianship." He looked toward the crowd with a theatrical sigh. "It breaks my heart, but if she refuses to come willingly, we must act." Clara didn't flinch. She had expected this. The murmurs in the crowd began. Words like unfit, mad, and danger floated between pews like wasps. Silas smirked, turning back toward the judge. "I only seek what's best, a place for her to live, to be cared for, and, by the law, access to the land she no longer understands how to manage." Miss Adeline rose from her bench slowly, papers of her own in hand. Her voice cut through the room like a bell. "Your Honor," she said, "what Mr. Greeley neglects to mention is that these letters are forgeries. This medical record belongs to a different Clara, Clara Ann Bell, born in Ohio, not Clara May Bell of Pine Hollow." She walked forward and laid a folded parchment on the judge's table. "This is the original deed, signed by Clara's mother, never surrendered. The land belongs to her by law. Mr. Greeley knew this. He tried to buy it. She said no. Now he wants to take it." The judge glanced between the documents, jaw tight. Silas sputtered, but the courtroom had shifted. Eyes turned now, not in mockery but uncertainty. And then Clara stepped forward. "I've been called unstable," she said, voice trembling only slightly. "But let me speak my own truth. She opened her journal, fingers smoothing its spine. When I had no one, I wrote to survive. When I was hungry, I dreamed of orchards. When I was laughed at, I planted words where no one could trample them. She read aloud a poem, short, unpolished, raw, about a girl who buried her mother and walked away with nothing but her own name, about hope like frost, quiet, persistent, clinging even in bitterness. The room went still. Even the children stopped whispering. She closed the journal. This is who I am, not the papers he waves, not the rumors you whispered. The judge sat back. His voice was weary but firm. I'll need time to consider. We reconvene at sunrise. The gavel struck once. Outside, the wind had died down. The snow had ceased. The people gathered in twos and threes, murmuring in tones less certain than before. Perhaps they'd been wrong. Perhaps she was not what they'd been told. And that man beside her, broad as a bear, silent as granite, who was he really? Clara walked out with her head high. Colt followed close, his stare landing on Silas like the promise of a storm yet to come. The first light of dawn spilled gently over Pine Hollow, casting gold across rooftops still crusted with frost. The storm had passed, leaving behind a hush that felt like breath held in waiting. Inside the church, Clara stirred from the narrow cot, the morning cold curling around her like a question unanswered. She rose without waking anyone, pulling her shawl tight, and stepped outside into the pale morning. Colt was by the well. He stood still, steam rising from his breath, one hand braced on the stone rim. His coat was dusted with frost, and the quiet around him was deep, not heavy, but expectant. As she approached, he turned slowly. His eyes, always clear and steady, met hers without hesitation. In his hand, he held something small, wrapped in a square of cloth. He opened it with care. A ring carved from pine, worn smooth and polished with oil. It was simple but shaped by hands that had carved in grief and now perhaps in hope. You don't need saving, Colt said, his voice low and even. You never did. He paused, thumb brushing the edge of the ring. But I'd like to stand beside you, if you'll have me. Clara felt her breath catch, not from surprise, but from the enormity of it. Not the ring, not the question, but the steadiness in his face. The quiet dignity of a man who wasn't rescuing her, but offering something harder, a shared life. She looked down at the ring, then up into his eyes. You know they'll laugh, she whispered, the old doubt trying to rise. Let them, he said. He took her hand, and together they walked down the main road into town. The street was just beginning to wake. Doors opened, boots hit boardwalks, shop signs creaked on rusted hinges. But when they saw Clara, hand in hand with the man once thought mad, something shifted. Conversation stopped. Mouths hung open. A child dropped a hoop in the dirt and watched in silence. Even the old men by the feed store who lived to mutter judgments fell still. Clara walked with her head high, her steps steady. Colt walked beside her without speaking, without blinking, not as her shield, but as her equal. When they reached the chapel steps, the preacher looked up from sweeping snow off the porch. He saw their hands, saw the ring in hers. For a moment, he simply stared. Then a slow smile broke across his weathered face. Without a word, he turned and walked to the bell rope. The sound rang out over the town. Clean, clear, unmistakable. Not the toll of mourning, not the summons of judgment. A wedding bell. People came out of their homes. A woman clutched her apron. A boy lowered his cap. Even the tavern door creaked open, and its patrons stood blinking in the light, unsure of what they were witnessing. Claire and Colt stood at the base of the church steps, the morning sun catching the edge of her cheek. She wore no lace. He wore no suit. But there was a stillness around them, one that made even the harshest whispers fade. Across the street, Silas Greeley stood at the window of the sheriff's office, his fingers curled tight around a folded paper. His face, once smug and self-assured, had gone pale. The smile was gone. In its place was stone. He had not expected this. Not love, not defiance, not a woman they'd all dismissed standing proudly beside a man they feared. The bell rang again, and Pine Hollow began to change. The night in Pine Hollow was quiet until it wasn't. Flames licked the sky behind Miss Adeline's home, turning the blackness orange as the barn caught fire in a sudden, violent bloom. Screams rang out, boots thudded against frozen dirt, and water buckets formed a line too slow to matter. By the time the fire was out, the barn was a skeleton of smoldering beams and ash. Silas Greeley stood at the edge of the crowd, arms folded, face calm. But when the deputy arrived, badge crooked and eyes anxious, it was Silas who spoke first. "It was him," he said, pointing into the smoke. "McCrae. He was seen nearby. You know what he is, what he's done before. This town's seen his kind." The deputy hesitated, glancing at Miss Adeline, who clutched her shawl and said nothing, her eyes wide and horrified. The law in Pine Hollow wasn't built on proof. It ran on fear, on who spoke first and who spoke loudest. By morning, Colt sat in a cell, wrists bound, face impassive. He hadn't resisted, hadn't spoken a word. Clara had run through the snow to the jailhouse, dress soaked, heart pounding, voice hoarse with disbelief. "You know he didn't do it," she told the deputy, hands gripping the bars. "He was with me, the whole night. He never left the church." The deputy looked away. "Judge said he'd hear it come sunrise. That's all I can say." Clara turned to the preacher. "Please, you saw us. You know him." The old man nodded slowly. "I'll speak, but it's the town that needs to listen." And they did, when the bell rang again. This time it wasn't the adults who stepped forward first. It was the children. Small voices rose from the back of the church, timid but insistent. "He's not bad," said one girl, clinging to her father's hand. "He saved a fox with a broken leg, brought it to Miss Clara." "He brought her berries," another said. "Left 'em in my book bag so she'd find them." "He carved me a horse," a boy whispered, holding up a rough little toy. "Didn't say nothing, just gave it and walked off." The room fell silent. Miss Adeline stood and placed her hand on Clara's shoulder. "Sometimes the ones who say the least give the most," she said. "Colt McCrae has carried enough grief to bury 10 men, but he's never once asked for pity. And when evil knocked on our town's door, it was him who stood between it and a woman you all turned away." The judge didn't answer right away. He looked toward Silas, who stood pale-faced now, jaw clenched. But Colt? He sat in his cell, unmoving. Not because he was beaten, not because he was afraid, because he had learned long ago that truth didn't need to shout. It only needed to endure. Clara stepped beside him, her hand reaching through the bars, resting over his. She whispered, "You're not alone this time." And this time, the town was listening. The snow had melted enough for the ground to soften, and the old church creaked with the sound of spring wind through its shutters. Children played in the aisles while the preacher and Miss Adeline prepared the sanctuary for Sunday. One boy, Jacob, no older than 8, had wedged himself between the pew and the back wall, chasing a wooden top that had spun out of reach. As he reached in, his hand brushed something brittle and dry. Curious, he tugged, and out came a folded envelope, yellowed with time and bound with a faded green ribbon. "Miss Adeline," he called, holding it up. "I found a letter." She took it gently, brushing off the dust. Her eyes widened at the name scrawled across the back. "To be read if I do not return. Lily McCrae." Her breath caught. She turned the envelope over in her hands, heart thudding. The next morning the courtroom was packed again. Warmer this time, but tenser. Colt sat at the defense table, still behind bars, his face unreadable. Clara stood beside him, her hand resting on the wood, steady and unshaken. Silas lounged smugly in the corner, arms crossed, confident his web of lies had held. Then Miss Adeline stepped forward. "I submit a document newly discovered, hidden in the church for over a decade," she said, her voice ringing clear. "It is the final letter of Lily McCrae, written before her death. Its contents bear directly on the charges before us." The judge motioned for her to continue. She unfolded the letter slowly and began to read aloud. "To whom it may concern, if this letter is found, it means I did not survive childbirth. My husband Colt will likely retreat from the world. He carries too much sorrow and too little forgiveness for himself. But let it be known that he is an honest man. He refused the bribe Silas Greeley offered him 2 weeks ago. Land in exchange for silence about a forged document Silas used to cheat our neighbor, Samuel Grant, out of his property." Gasps rippled through the room. Silas shifted in his seat, color draining from his cheeks. "I begged Colt to speak out. He refused, not out of fear, but because he believed no one would listen. I write this now in hope that someday someone will. Colt McCrae is not a criminal. He is the only good man I've ever known." Miss Adeline folded the letter gently, her hands trembling. The judge leaned forward. "This letter calls into question not just the arrest, but the very foundation of Mr. Greeley's dealings in this town. I am ordering Colt McCrae released immediately, and I'm opening a formal investigation into Greeley's land acquisitions." Colt stood slowly as the deputy unlocked his cuffs. He didn't smile. He just turned to Clara, nodded once, and took her hand. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds as if the land itself had taken a breath. Townsfolk gathered on the courthouse steps, not to jeer or whisper, but to watch. Some removed their hats. Others murmured apologies that caught in their throats. A woman once mocked for her body and her age stood shoulder to shoulder with a man once feared as a monster, and neither looked like victims anymore. Clara looked out across the crowd and saw faces changed, not by force, but by truth revealed. And Silas, standing alone beneath the awning, watched as his empire cracked, not from fire or violence, but from a single letter written by a dying woman who had trusted that goodness, in time, would speak louder than greed. Silas Greeley stood on the courthouse steps like a man cornered by shadows and too proud to admit he'd lost. His coat flapped in the rising wind, and his jaw clenched as he watched Clara and Colt leave the building, hand in hand, heads high. The crowd that had once leaned in his direction now shifted, murmuring with new uncertainty. Their eyes no longer cast toward him for answers, but away from him in quiet shame. "You think this is over?" Silas barked, stepping forward. His voice cracked through the square like a whip. "You think a letter and a sob story make a man right and a woman clean? He's still a murderer. She's still a lunatic hiding behind poems." Colt stopped, turned. His gaze met Silas's, slow and heavy. "Come down here, McCrae," Silas spat. "Let's settle it like men. You and me. No law, no judge, just truth and bullets." A hush fell over the square. People stepped back, sensing danger curling in the space between two histories colliding. The sheriff stood nearby, arms folded, saying nothing. Colt walked forward, slow as a mountain moving. He came to the edge of the steps and looked up at Silas. "No," he said. Silas blinked, stunned. "I don't need to kill you," Colt said, voice low and even. "The truth already did." He turned away, but then Clara stepped forward, past Colt, past the murmuring crowd. She held her journal in both hands, pages worn and weathered from years of use. She looked not at Silas but at the townsfolk, at the women who had turned their parasols away, at the men who once laughed, at the children who watched with eyes wide and unsure. She opened her journal. I'm not what you expected, she began, voice soft but clear. Not thin, not young, not married at the right time or quiet in the right way. Someone near the front lowered their eyes. I was called a burden by my own blood, laughed at for my size, ignored for my worth, and still I stayed kind. Still I wrote, because if I didn't write my truth, I'd vanish. Her hands trembled, but she kept reading. I have feared my body. I have feared my voice. I have feared that love was a thing meant for smaller women and quieter hearts. But then I met a man who saw me, not in spite of who I was, but because of it. And I saw him, not a ghost, not a savage, but a man who had suffered quietly while we all looked away. She closed the book. Silence fell. Heavy. Real. A woman near the back wept. A boy sniffled. Then a man in a brown vest, one of Silas's former drink partners, stepped forward and spat at Silas's feet. You did this, he said. All of it. Silas went red, then pale. He opened his mouth to shout, but the sheriff raised a hand. That's enough, the lawman said, stepping forward. Silas Greeley, you're under arrest for arson, fraud, and falsifying court documents. You'll face trial in the Capitol. Silas stammered, backing up. But no one stepped in to save him. No deputy, no friend. The sheriff clamped cuffs on his wrists with the finality of thunder. No bullet had been fired, but justice rang through Pine Hollow like a shot through silence. And this time, it hit its mark. Spring came slowly to the mountains, like a child learning to walk, tentative, uneven, but full of promise. With Silas Greeley hauled off in chains and the courthouse papers corrected, Clara Bell's name was restored to the deed that rightfully bore it. The land near the timberline, frozen for so long in silence and sorrow, was now hers without question. But it didn't feel like ownership. It felt like belonging. She and Colt returned to the cabin together, their hands full not just with tools and supplies, but with purpose. The path up the ridge had thawed in patches, revealing the same winding trail that once carried her away in fear and now brought her home with resolve. The cabin stood quiet and waiting, weathered but strong. The snow had melted from the roof. The door creaked on its hinges, as if waking from sleep. They began to rebuild, not with fanfare, but with quiet determination. Colt patched the shutters, reinforced the roof, and redug the well with his steady, silent skill. Clara swept every corner clean, hung curtains that fluttered in the breeze, and unpacked her journal, setting it back on the small shelf by the window where light could find it. And then came the townsfolk. First, it was Miss Adeline and the preacher, arriving with a basket of fresh bread and seeds bundled in cotton, beans, carrots, wildflowers. Then came the smith, hauling iron nails and extra hinges. A widow from the southern bluff brought a jar of honey and a note written in careful script. Thank you for showing us what bravery looks like. Children followed behind with hand-me-down books, extra blankets, a carved spoon, a kitten someone had found abandoned. No one said the word sorry. They didn't need to. Clara planted the garden beside the birch tree, where the soil was soft and rich with memory. She planted flowers first, lilies for Lily, bluebells for Ruthie, then vegetables, careful rows traced with twine. Colt worked beside her, kneeling in the dirt, palms calloused and gentle. Inside, the cradle was brought down from its shadowed perch in the loft. Clara placed it near the hearth, lined it with fresh linens and the pine-carved toys Colt had made in the long nights of winter. It sat there now, not as a reminder of what had been lost, but of what might one day be. Clara began writing letters, real ones, sent down the ridge with the preacher. She wrote to women she'd met in passing, to girls who whispered truth between cracked lips, to widows with nowhere left to go. She wrote of strength, of safety, of a place in the mountains where kindness lived and hands didn't hurt. Some letters came back with trembling replies. Others came with footsteps on the path. Colt built chairs in the evenings, each one crafted with care and a little flourish. A bird carved into the armrest, a sun etched into the back. He gave them to the orphanage, to the schoolhouse, to anyone who needed a place to rest. He never charged a cent. Together they worked. They healed. They did not pretend the past hadn't happened, but they let it rest, like ash in the soil, something that once burned, now feeding new life. They were no longer alone. The sun was just beginning to rise when Clara stirred beneath the quilt. The early light spilled across the wooden floor of the cabin, soft and golden, warming the worn edges of the cradle near the hearth. A breeze moved the curtain slightly, and the scent of blooming lilacs drifted in, blending with the faint smell of cedar smoke and bread from the night before. The air felt alive, as if the land itself was exhaling after years of holding its breath. She lay still for a moment, listening to the slow rhythm of Colt's breath beside her. Then quietly, her hand moved to rest on her belly. There was no great sign, no sudden flutter, just a knowing, gentle and certain, as if something within her had begun to hum a new note in the melody of her life. Tears welled in her eyes, not from fear or doubt, but from something deeper, joy, fragile and full. She turned her face to the ceiling and whispered a thank you she wasn't sure who to direct to. God, the trees, the little girl buried beneath the birch, or the man beside her who had given her shelter when the world had shut every door. Colt opened his eyes some time later and found her standing barefoot in the doorway, arms crossed gently over her waist, face tilted to the wind. She looked over her shoulder, and he saw it in her eyes before she spoke. He didn't ask. He just walked over and placed his hand over hers, resting it gently where her fingers curled. His voice, when it came, was no louder than a whisper. "You sure?" She nodded. That afternoon they went to town. The path that had once felt so long, so full of uncertainty, now felt different. They walked hand in hand, like they had the morning the bell rang. But this time Clara's steps were softer, slower. As they passed homes and storefronts, faces peeked out and voices greeted them, not with suspicion, but with warmth. "Miss Clara," someone said, tipping a hat. "Good to see you, ma'am," said another. And then from the far end of the square, a girl no taller than a fence post shouted, "Is it true? Are you going to have a baby?" Clara blushed but nodded. Colt gave the smallest smile. By sundown, the whole town had gathered in the field behind the chapel. Miss Adeline organized the tables, and the preacher offered a prayer of thanksgiving. Children danced barefoot in the grass. Someone strummed a fiddle. Pies were passed, biscuits devoured, and laughter echoed in the hills. No one called her names anymore. Not a word about her weight, not a whisper about her age. She was Mama-to-be now. She was Ma'am, said with respect. She was Miss Clara, spoken with warmth. Colt stood near the edge of the gathering, hands in his pockets, watching the woman he once found crying behind a stable now laugh among the people who'd once turned their backs. His eyes were damp, but he didn't wipe them. He just looked at her, really looked, and knew that this moment, this life, was the second chance neither of them had dared to hope for. In the fading light, Clara sat beside him, rested her head against his shoulder and whispered, "She's coming home." He didn't ask who. He just nodded, because somehow he already knew. The bell rang again. Its clear tone rose over Pine Hollow just as the morning mist pulled back from the fields, as if even the fog paused to listen. It was not the hurried clamor of danger or the solemn toll of morning. It was slow, strong, and full, like a memory returning home. A little girl with curls the color of wheat and eyes too wise for her years ran barefoot through the meadow just below the chapel hill. Wildflowers brushed her knees, golden asters, purple lupine. Bright bluebells planted by her mother years ago. She clutched a small wooden horse in one hand, its legs chipped from play, but still proud. Her laughter rose into the sky, a sound that turned heads and lifted hearts. Up on the ridge, just where the pines thinned and the grass grew soft, Clara knelt in the garden she had built from ash. Her hands, though slower now, still moved with care, coaxing new life from the soil. Her hair had turned silver in strands that caught the light, and lines now shaped her face, deep and kind. But her eyes had lost none of their fire. She stood, wiping her hands on her apron, and looked out across the valley toward the sound of the bell. Behind her, smoke curled gently from the chimney. Inside the cabin, Colt sat in his chair by the hearth, carving slowly. His beard was mostly white now, his back a little more bent, but the strength in his hands hadn't left. He worked on a piece of soft pine, another toy perhaps, or maybe just something to keep his hands busy while the world he once feared losing bloomed around him. On the porch, the preacher's wife rocked in her chair, knitting in her lap, a soft tune on her lips. She'd outlived the preacher by 3 years, and when he passed, it was Clara and Colt who helped her carry his chair to the hill where the birches grew. The town watched that day in reverent silence. No sermons were preached, only the sound of the bell and the planting of flowers. The town had changed. The cruelest tongues had gone quiet or left entirely. New families had come. A schoolhouse had been built on the old Greeley land, and its walls were painted with murals, one of a mountain, a woman in a shawl, and a cradle near a fire. No one mocked the stranger anymore. No one feared the man in the woods. Because years ago, when hate rode loud and truth whispered low, kindness had raised its voice. It had stood in a woman once called too fat to marry. It had lived in a man too broken to speak, and it had grown in the silence between them, where hope took root like seeds in good earth. That little girl, the one running through the field, stopped at the garden's edge and looked up. "Mama," she said, breathless, "they're ringing the bell again. Is it for me?" Clara smiled. "No, darling, it's for everyone." She turned and looked at the cabin, at the land, at the place where she had once been broken and now stood whole. Because in the heart of the wilderness, long after the world had turned its back, a woman once mocked as too old, too heavy, too late, had become the mother of a town's redemption, and the bell kept ringing.